Most all of us have had or are currently having the experience of being a student in relationship to a teacher. And most all of us, I suspect, think sometimes of the teacher-student relationship as perhaps capturing for us something of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. But discipleship in the Gospels is different. It's very different. It begins with the reality that at a place like the university, by and large, the students pick their professors. And they can change that professor if they're not succeeding, perhaps, with them. But discipleship for this Jesus is more about not the student choosing the professor, but here in this relationship, the professor chooses the student. You see, following Jesus is not my idea, my plan, my project, my thesis. Disciples of Jesus are called against their custom, their way of life, against their life project, their plans, probably even against their idea of what religion and spirituality should be. And this discipleship is not just for a time, a semester, a year, maybe more. This discipleship is forever. Another big difference. We study under professors to learn something in particular about something in particular we don't know. Science, perhaps, novels, poetry, engineering. It's the professor and the student looking together at this thing. But the truth is, we don't follow Jesus to learn, for example, the Torah. They were not following Jesus so that this rabbi could pass on the Torah to them. We follow Jesus to fish for people. To fish for people along with this Jesus. This, you see, is about a relationship actually happening, and relationships happening around them. What Jesus did was to begin to create a new way of being together. Jesus and his disciples were creating a new way of being together with them. Another huge difference. In the ancient world, the student served the teacher, even becoming their servant, even to the point of being or acting at least like a slave. The student became the one who washed the rabbi's feet, or cleared the table, or cleaned the house, or goes to the market. Serving the teacher is how they defined themselves as a student. But with Jesus, things were very different in a way that was unheard of at his time. What Jesus was constantly inculcating into his disciples was a new way of being together. A new way of being together. He would not allow himself to be served. Instead, he is the servant at his disciples' table. And finally, the last big difference. These days, to do graduate work at a university like this is to do most all of our graduate work in the security of that particular university environment, with an established funding, usually from outside grants. But not so for Jesus. Being his disciple means following him into always changing situations. Following him into always changing circumstances. But within these always changing circumstances, there were certain guidelines, certain ways of being together that marked this little gathering of the future of Israel. They were becoming like forgiveness. 77 times a day, he said, which is to say constantly. This new gathering, this new family, this new community must be a group of human beings that are constantly forgiving each other. They could not and must not live together any other way in the reign of God. Here's something else it looked like. There was no stable place for this Jesus. He traveled constantly. He lived in an unstable, itinerant, pilgrim fashion, totally surrendering to whatever this situation of the approaching reign of God demanded at any particular time. This Jesus had no place to lay his head. And they only stored enough bread for that night and the next day. And they had no idea where they were going to rest that next night. They were always relying, hoping on the kindness of others. They only prayed for enough bread for the day. And they traveled light. You see, this way of being together, these guidelines that mark them, were intended to point beyond them to something new, to this new thing that was happening now in the world. And to us, maybe looking from the outside, it looks brutal, it looks deprived. That's what it might seem like. But these disciples were not alone. Around them, the true intention of Israel was beginning to gather steam. They were indeed without means, but they have everything. They are indeed poor, and yet they are rich. A group of people throughout the land, now all seized by this reign of God, trusting one another without reservation, sharing with one another, caring for each other. They were caught up in this inexhaustible care, which left them free and available. They were constantly endangered, and yet incomprehensibly blessed. They were a new understanding of family. They were each other's new family. This is a different kind of discipleship from anything known until this time. And this new community, this new family they were forming, would only be passed from person to person, from one to another. There is no automatic transfer of faith to the next generation. Parents and grandparents, did you hear that? There is no automatic transfer of faith to the next generation. It's passed from person to person, one to another. Calling and following must be handed on face to face. It takes a nudge. It takes a nudge from someone. And this is not a call directed to everyone. It was only for those Jesus chose for himself. He expects of them that they would share in the embrace of his unstable, itinerant life. It is a call for this new life together, this new form of life together, insecure and hard for sure, but for this very reason. It presupposes the freedom to say yes or no. I will follow or I will not. No one will be forced to live this way. You see, what was happening everywhere all the time in this world of Jesus and his disciples was that all together they were a sign of this now inbreaking reign of God. This new kind of human community was this new thing they were doing together. This is what the Torah always intended for Israel to become. And it was happening. In this moment, captured in this gospel this morning, the last times are here. The reign of God is occurring in the gathering of people into this new society. The fields are ripe for the harvest. Peter and Andrew, the other disciples, will work with Jesus, gathering people, gathering people, gathering people for this reign of God. Will you? Will you join him in this? Jesus is looking for a few good women and men who are not perfect, but who are willing to be indicative signs of the reign of God among us. Indicative signs of the reign of God among us. Who would be willing to live this difficult and wonderful life. Are you interested? Think about it. Please consider it. You owe it to yourself to consider it. Might you be being called to be a disciple of this Jesus? And I'm not just talking about priesthood or religious life here. Every profession, every career, every neighborhood needs to be peopled with disciples, people who are trying to be these kinds of indicative signs of this coming, occurring, real reign of God, the way the world God imagined it to be, lived in the flesh of this particular disciple, this particular human being. For sure it's okay if you decide that I'm just called to be a companion. That's fine. And maybe a sometimes helper of this along the way. Or even just part of the curious crowd giving him a look-see. All those ways of following are legitimate and they all have a place. But he's still calling that one group, you see. He's still calling women and men to follow him as well. He's still calling disciples. And he just may, be calling you. Consider this a nudge.